Hello again, everyone. Mike Goucher with you from Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we like to say are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. They are the authors of this book. It's called Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. This powerful story is about what's happened to America's working class over the last 50 years. We'll be talking about it in just a moment here, but first, a couple of words about our guests today. Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn are the first husband and wife to win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. They are the co-authors of 4 previous books, including the tremendous bestseller, Half the Sky. Kristof, familiar name to many of you. He is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. He's a former bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. And Sheryl WuDunn worked at the Times as a business editor and foreign correspondent in Tokyo and Beijing, and she now works in finance and consulting. They are with us today from Nick's hometown of Yam Hill, Oregon. Thanks to both of you for being with us today.
Delighted to be with you.
Thanks
we only wish
us,
we were physically at Marquette right now.
That's right. You're right here with us. Sheryl, let me begin with you. And let's talk for a moment about the title of this book, Tightrope. It's a metaphor for sort of where the working class in America is today. Describe what you mean by tightrope.
We chose that title partly because we saw the precariousness of life among so many people here in Yam Hill, but also across the country. We were surprised, of course, when we started out talking to people here in Yam Hill. They were Nick's friends. They rode on the school bus with him when they were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And everyone was happy-go-lucky, the future was so bright. And then we came back after going to, we, as foreign correspondents, we had traveled around the world, been to developing countries, seen so many poor regions. And we would come back home here in Yam Hill every year. And, we would meet with some of Nick's old friends. Some of them actually worked on the family farm. And over time, we started asking them questions about their life. And we realized that there was a humanitarian crisis unfolding in our own backyard. And these people were basically walking on a tightrope of life. I mean, there was so little, a breath between, falling off a cliff and actually being able to pay your bills. It was striking to us. And we couldn't believe that those young kids who were so, filled with hope, became hopeless here.
Nick, tell us a little bit about your hometown. This is what, about 30 miles outside of Portland?
Yeah, that's right. It's beautiful area right where the Willamette Valley folds into the coastal range. It's an area that's predominantly about agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing. It's an area that had done extraordinarily well for much of the 20th century. And so, So, for example, the family that got on the school bus right after me each morning, the Knapps, they had been able to, the dad had a job laying a sewer pipe. The mom drove a tractor, and they'd parlayed those jobs into being able to buy their first home and living kind of a pretty good, upwardly mobile life. When my classmate Farland, the oldest of the 5 kids, when he turned 16, the family was able to buy him a Ford Mustang, and I was incredibly jealous.
Sure.
And then, but then those jobs all, those jobs kind of disappeared. Those good union working class jobs disappeared, and the result was devastating for Yam Hill and for so many towns like it across the country. And so a quarter of the kids on my old number 6 bus are no longer with us. They've died of drugs, alcohol, or suicide.
A quarter of the kids.
What are called deaths of despair. And, this, when Sheryl and I were coming back, at first we wondered if this was something about my number 6 bus or something about Yam Hill. And of course it wasn't. It was something happening across the country in white, black, and brown communities across the country. The Knapps, who I mentioned a moment ago, Farland, my classmate, he lost his job, spiraled downward, self-medicated, and died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. His brother Zeelan died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Their sister Regina died of hepatitis from injecting drugs. And the youngest of the five, Keelan, he'd survived at the time the book came out only because he'd been in jail for 13 years. But after the book came out in March, he lost his job. He died from a heroin overdose. And so these five kids who would look forward, who had been from this upwardly mobile family, their mom is still alive and going strong, but all five of them died one after the other. And I keep thinking about how we as a society paid an awful lot to incarcerate the Knapps and not enough to invest in their education, in drug treatment, in job retraining.
Sheryl, this is something that's really been in the making for 50 years, isn't it? I mean, it's something that began back in 1970. We've seen this trend continue no matter who was in the White House, Republicans or Democrats. This has been an ongoing trend.
It actually has. I mean, on the one hand, it shows that policy makes a difference. We often think, oh, get this deal done. This has to close. We're going to close it this year, by the end of this year in December. It's got to go through. And then we forget about it. And we forget that there are huge impacts, as a result of the policy decisions of the lawmaking that we as a country actually, create. On the other hand, it isn't any particular party, although, sometimes the politics of it creates some of the havoc. And because the parties can't agree or one party has the upper hand, things will get done in a way that they really shouldn't have gotten done. The key, policies that have contributed to more of the larger issues like mass incarceration really started unfolding with the war on drugs in the 1980s, in particular, when the two laws on drugs actually were passed in 1986 and 1988. And that's when they basically said, okay, if you even have a tiny amount of marijuana, we're going to throw you in jail. And so you've got small, bit time, drug mules who were, asked to carry some, a little bag of heroin or some opioid pills on a train. They were thrown in jail as though they were drug lords. We tell the story of someone in Tightrope where this poor woman was basically lured to go down, on a train to meet a friend. And in the train station after arriving, she basically was accosted by the police and then thrown in jail. So, she wasn't going to, propagate, huge sales of drugs the way drug lords do in the U.S. And yet she was in jail for about 20 plus years. She was finally released after much effort. But think about, her life was ruined. If someone had put her in drug rehab, because she also used drugs herself, that would have been a much more effective solution and would have taken a small number of years. And then she could have become a more productive member of society. And we do write about some programs that do just that, and they should be scaled across the country.
Nick, I wanted to ask you, and I've seen you talk about this in other places too, but I guess one of the takeaways from your reporting that the two of you did for this book is that in your eyes, we are not the country we think we are. What do you mean by that?
So our vision of the country is that we are the land without class distinctions. We are the land of opportunity. And, there is a real thread to that. My dad was a refugee from Eastern Europe. Sheryl's grandparents were immigrants from China. And, there has been this historic element where people in some cases were able to really live the American dream. But that has become harder since the 1970s. Mobility has declined. Barriers have increased. It's no longer possible to work one's way through college, for example. And the educational barriers, in other words, basically we as a country, we send poor kids to poor schools and rich kids to terrific schools, create a kind of ossification of the system in which the advantaged propel opportunity to the next generation. Those who start out with little are likely to end up little. The best predictor of how you end up in life is where you start in life, which is so contrary to our vision of the country. And you know, we also, I mean, we talk about America's number one, and there is an element of truth to that. You know, we have the world's most powerful military, though we're the richest country in the history of the world, probably. And yet, by health metrics, we are, you know, the worst country in the G7 in terms of life expectancy. Children in the US are 55% more likely to die by age 19 than children in other OECD industrialized countries. Women in the US are 2 or 3 times as likely to die in pregnancy or childbirth as as women in Europe. And so we invented mass high school, we invented mass college attendance, and yet so many other countries have now eclipsed us in high school graduation rates and in college attendance. And so I hope that one of the points of writing Tightrope was as kind of a wake-up call, and to remind folks that we achieved American greatness in part by creating engines of opportunity, whether it be the GI Bill of Rights or that mass system of high schools, or you know, structures that rural electrification. Earlier, the Homestead Act was obviously devastating for Native Americans, but was a huge source of opportunity for white Americans. And we've, I think, backed away from those opportunity creating mechanisms. And we hope that Tightrope will help remind us that we can get back into the opportunity creation business.
To explore that point a little bit more and maybe to illustrate it, were you surprised at some of what you found in your reporting? I was taken by, in the book, you describe a health fair that happens in a small town in Tennessee. Describe for us what you found there. And it's something that I'm sure for a lot of Americans, we would think, well, that doesn't happen in America. That happens in some other country. That's not America.
You know, that the health fair is just pretty remarkable. It was founded by someone named Stan Brock, who actually started because he found himself in Latin America really sick. And he was in the remote village on hilltops and in the mountains. And actually he, you know, was befriended by some local villagers. They nursed him till he was better. And he said, you know what, to pay these people back, because they saved my life, I am actually going to bring healthcare to them. So he started creating these little health fairs, you know, in Latin America, in the poor areas. And then, you know, his headquarters was in Tennessee, as you mentioned. And pretty soon he was getting little inquiries from nearby towns. You know, I hear you do these health fairs in Latin America. Any chance you can do one in our town? We could really use one. So he said, sure, why not? So he opens up, you know, a health fair in the neighboring town. And there was a line the night before, miles, I mean, just around the area, just people lined up to get this free healthcare. And they, you know, it was remarkable. And now he's actually extended these health fairs, you know, across the country. I mean, you know, he does 80 different cities. And unfortunately, Stan Brock is no longer with us, but thankfully, the tradition has continued. And now they've got, you know, access. You can even get your eyes, your glasses done. You can get your hearing attended to. You can get, you know, pap smears. Women can get pap smears done. So they've really broadened it, but it's remarkable how important the dental care is. People come in there, and I was just shocked. Literally, there was one woman who was so desperate from the pain in her teeth that she wanted every tooth had a problem, and she said, pull them all out. So she had all of her teeth pulled out, and we took a photo of all her teeth just sitting on, you know, the dental tray. I mean, it was just so heartbreaking, but she was so grateful because her teeth really, you know, they had been really painful to her. We had one doctor who explained he says it is heartbreaking because he sees these young people who also are having their teeth pulled. And he remembers once having a argument with a 21-year-old who wanted all her teeth pulled out. And he said, why? Because I can just repair them. I can, fill the cavities, whatnot. She goes, no. I know we have 3 sets of teeth. You have your baby teeth, and then you lose those, and you get your adult teeth, and then you can lose those, and you get your dentures. So she wanted to put in dentures. He goes, I'm not going to do this to you. I can't. She goes, but he said to her, you're just going to go to as many dentists as possible until you find one who can do this for you. And she goes, yes. He refused to do it.
Wow. I want to spend a little time talking about some of what's happened to the working class. And let's begin with the disappearance of jobs. It's something we can relate to in the Milwaukee area. We lost a lot of manufacturing jobs over the years. I guess the question is, were those job losses inevitable? Or were those policy choices that were made by government?
So I think that there is a perception among many elites in the US that it's too bad what has happened to these working class communities, but that's what happens when you have globalization, when you have mechanization, and when you have people who are just not terribly adaptable. And I think that explanation misses the boat. Look, Germany had globalization and mechanization, plus, of course, integration in the European community. And it did not go through the kind of crisis of addiction and suicide that the United States did. The same with Canada. And so absolutely, there were challenges from globalization, mechanization, absolutely. But where you have an education system that gets everybody through high school, for example, and in many cases gives them vocational skills or college skills, then it creates a measure of resilience so people can adapt. When, one interesting contrast was after the 2008-2009 recession, then Ford Motor Company laid off auto workers both in Detroit and right across the border in Canada in Windsor, Ontario. And the US policy response was to provide an income stream, unemployment checks to the US laid off workers. On the Canadian side, there was a determined effort to provide job retraining. And they looked and, okay, Ontario isn't going to need a lot of welders, but we are going to need healthcare workers. And, we can start a new class for you on Monday and give you skills as an ultrasound operator or as a nurse, whatever it may be. And of course, also on the Canadian side, people, when they lost their job, they didn't lose healthcare. And so today, more than a decade later, those who lost their jobs on the Canadian side, because of the policy response, are doing better. Their families were less likely to break up. They and their children are less likely to be dealing with substance abuse, with suicide, with these deaths of despair. So, yes, there were huge challenges, but fundamentally, the bad choices that are made not only by some individual workers, and clearly some do make bad choices, but they're also made by us as a society as a whole.
And I'd like to add something here. I mean, what's really important is that people think, oh my gosh, big government, it just overtakes lives. But, in the example that Nick was talking about in Canada, the Canadian government only stepped in when it was necessary. They didn't stay in the people's lives. I mean, of course, they have national health care. So that is a big government, but it provides a useful function. I mean, it's not there just for the sake of being there. It allows people much more mobility because here in the US, when people lost their jobs with the layoffs, they also lost their health care. So you're getting a double whammy. If you can at least provide healthcare for your family as you're looking for a job, then you're not going to have crisis upon crisis, with additional healthcare issues. So I think that people have to recognize this is not just this big label socialized socialism. It is purposeful, intervention that really gives people a helping hand. We all need helping hands every now and then.
Something else I want to talk about that is very much a thread in the book is the impact of the opioid crisis on the working class. And I'm wondering if each of you would describe for us your take on that. Is how big a role is that playing in what's happened to the working class today?
So as I look at the kids on my old bus, my neighbors, it was huge. I should say it wasn't just opioids. It was also
Alcohol,
methamphetamine and alcohol. And in fact, more Americans die each year as a consequence of alcohol than as a consequence of drug overdoses. So they are both enormous killers. But I think that also drugs have been toxic to the social capital in communities like this, and that when people have addictions, it becomes very difficult to provide community support. Community institutions tend to erode. We're already eroded and then eroded further. But I think it's worth also trying to push back at some of the narratives that have spread about this, where people see this simply as an example of personal irresponsibility. And first of all, one should note that in the US, about 80% of those who are addicted to heroin started off with prescription painkillers. And one reason the US has this extraordinary problem with overdoses is because we gave enormous latitude to drug companies to peddle opioids in enormously irresponsible ways. The real predators of people on my old school bus weren't so much Colombian drug lords, although they played a role, but rather pharmaceutical executives who made millions on those transactions. And I guess I'd also say that, there absolutely was personal irresponsibility. And I mentioned the Naps, 5 kids gone. They made some really dumb decisions. But we as a society did not provide drug treatment to them and people like them. Even now, 80% of Americans who have dependency issues do not get treatment, even though that treatment pays for itself several times over. And what I'd like to see, and one reason, again, we wrote Tightrope, is a little less kind of finger pointing, a little less of a judgmental scorn for those who struggle, and a little bit more compassion, a little bit more of a helping hand instead of that pointing finger.
You saw that scorn up close, did you not? I noted in the book that you posted on Facebook about the death of one of your childhood friends. And you said the response to it, he died at 54, I believe, and from a variety of health issues. But the response to it was pretty tough. People were saying, hey, you made bad choices, bad life choices. That's what happens if you don't follow the right path. Were you surprised at the response of people you knew to what happened to him?
Yeah, I was kind of hurt by it. It was also something, frankly, we worried about in writing the book. The person you're talking about was my old friend and high school running buddy, Kevin Green, who died some years ago. His brother, Clayton, was also a very dear friend. And we have a number of pictures of Clayton in the book. And Clayton was 400 pounds. He had abused drugs. He had cooked meth for a while. And we worried a little bit that in writing the full picture of Clayton, that we would end up buttressing these kinds of prejudices and this kind of a stigma instead of trying to explain a really complicated person who did some dumb things, but was also a deeply loyal friend, tremendously reliable, great heart, really smart. And if he hadn't been kicked out of school in the 9th grade, might have ended up doing really great things. And this hostility to those who struggle in the US, and this emphasis on the kind of pull yourselves up by the bootstraps narrative, I think fundamentally is the reason why we have so many policies in the US that simply haven't worked. At the end of the day, people, other countries provide all kinds of early childhood support, early childhood programs. And while people like Clayton make some bad choices, it's we as a society who make those bad choices in terms of the opportunities that are available to them. And I think a little more compassion and a little less finger pointing would be very helpful.
But actually, I'd like to, address something. It's not just compassion. It also, there are real practical reasons why we think that you have to address these problems. And one example of how one can address the problems is an organization that we talk about in Tightrope in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's called Women in Recovery. And it basically looks at women who are destined for jail, for incarceration. Actually, Tulsa has one of the highest female incarceration rates. And they say if the underlying reason for your incarceration is because you had an addiction, right? Then let's not put you in jail for 5-10 years. That's not going to solve anyone's problem, because you're going to sit there, you're actually going to come out and you're going to still be addicted, or you're going to come back and commit the same, same crimes. Let's put you through an addiction, treatment program. So you actually get treatment, get rehabilitation, and you come out much better. So for instance, they put people through therapy, and drug treatment. They give them business skills training and apprenticeship, and they actually help them find a job. So less than 2 years later, they come out as a productive member of society. They are contributing, paying taxes, which is what we all want to see. So that helps our country, and it saves money. In fact, the Tulsa program has saved the local community about $70 million over the years that they've been in existence. So that's one thing. It actually saves money, and it allows people to become contributors to society. But the other major issue gets to something that Nick mentioned, and that is just competitiveness of the country. So we are looking at China with 1.4 billion people, and India soon to have 1.4 billion people. How are we going to compete as a country when we have only a small sliver of the American population that is functioning at full capacity and full potential? We need every single American working on all their cylinders to actually achieve the kind of potential so that we can actually compete against China and remain as number one. Do you want to be in a country that is number 26? Do you want to be in a country that is number 46 in access to clean water, or number 41 in access to the internet? Do we really want to live in that kind of country? We like to live in a country that's number one. So to get back to number one, we need all of Americans to really push all of their cylinders.
Well, while the two of you detail, some of the despair that we see in the working class today, and frankly, some of the dysfunction we see in the working class, I think one of the things I found interesting in the book was that you made a pretty strong case, I think, based on your reporting, for the importance of families, stable families, intact families, two-parent families, marriage, the institution of marriage. That was something that it struck me as you finding that is a way for people to get out. If they are from, these stable environments, it does make a huge difference in their trajectory in life.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of evidence for that. And this was a conservative narrative that I think, because it was a conservative narrative, liberals tended to be wary of, and there was concern that one was blaming the victim and blaming people for their own poverty. But there has been just an increasing pile of evidence that, especially for boys, for reasons we don't fully understand, but that boys in particular have better outcomes on average when they are raised in a two-parent household. And that's partly an economic function, that two parents are more likely to have two incomes and have more resources to invest. They're less likely to live in poverty. But it also may have something to do with a male role model. We're not fully sure, but those outcomes are substantially better. High school graduation rates, less contact with the law. And so I think that conservatives were fundamentally right in that prescription, in that diagnosis of what is at issue. I think they were wrong in their prescriptions, that simply urging people to get married didn't really work terribly well. The two things that really do seem to have a positive effect on formation of strong families, one is helping at-risk young men get jobs. And so job training that gives them a career so they become a plumber or electrician, whatever it may be, and earn an income, that strongly improves marriage outcomes. And the other is helping at-risk teenage girls not get pregnant. And so if they don't get pregnant and have a baby at 16 or 17, they're more likely than to get married at 22 and have children in the context of that two-parent household. So, what's so frustrating, Mike, is that we have the toolboxes to address so many of these problems. We have the resources. What we don't have is the political will.
Let's talk about that. You do propose in this book a number of potential policy actions that could address some of this. Maybe we can walk through some of the ones that you feel are particularly important or would stand the best chance of action by a legislative body. Sheryl, I'll begin with you on that.
Well, I think that education is one area that people can, for the most part, agree that we need to improve education outcomes. So that a lot of it can start very early. Other countries have used child allowances, which is a way to target the money so that it's not spent on other things that the parents might use, but really it's focused on allowing the parents to care for the child with some subsidy. And so, I mean, that's important because so many kids don't have enough food to eat here in the U.S. They don't have shelter. Some of that can help. Baby bonds, that's been something thrown about as well. That's another way to actually promote, education-focused, long-term planning. So you give a baby bond to a kid, but it's only used for education, at a certain time when the baby has grown old. But it gives the family a sense of planning. There are other programs that can really help with early childhood education because we think the early years are extremely important. That's when the brain is growing the fastest, and so if the baby who we normally think is very resilient, they're not as resilient as we think. And so when a baby is exposed to trauma or abuse, the cortisol is running through their brain and it disrupts the creation and the development of the brain architecture. So you need to make sure that that is stable. So programs like nurse-family partnership, home visitation programs are really important to basically give parenting classes to the parent. It's like even before the baby is born, nurses are coming in to tell the mother, please don't drink, please don't smoke, please don't do drugs. And when the baby is born, it's please hug the baby, nurture the baby, kiss the baby. I mean, some of us do that naturally, but it's not necessarily natural to a young mother who really isn't ready for having children. And so programs like that are really effective. And there are other things that we think are important too. But we think that education, and especially early childhood education, is a really key component to improving the situation.
Nick, on a couple of other policy possibilities, raising the minimum wage, increasing the earned income tax credit, things like that. Is that something else we should be looking at as we try to address some of the concerns that we see in the working class?
Absolutely. And indeed, raising the earned income tax credit makes eminent sense. It's politically agreed to by left and right. Raising the minimum wage is something that has about 80% national public approval. But I'd also note that it's not just a matter of raising the minimum wage. It's also a matter of raising the productivity of workers so that they can provide that marginal productivity to the company that hires them. And so in Denmark, for example, we noted that McDonald's workers there make about $22 an hour plus generous benefits. And that works with the McDonald's business model in Denmark, partly because somebody who works at McDonald's there is going to be a high school graduate who is literate, who is numerate, does not have a dependency issue. Whereas those at the lower end of the labor force in the US, unfortunately, because of 50 years of neglect of investments, are probably not going to be high school graduates or may not be literate or numerate. And so we have to raise the minimum wage. We also have to invest in the human capital of American workers.
Just a couple more questions. And one of them is something that you do touch on in the book. And I think this is oftentimes conversations about the working class end up being conversations about what happened to the white working class. And in the book, you make the point that the kind of struggles that you see in rural areas are the same kind of struggles you see in urban areas. But somehow, doesn't that seem like that gets lost in today's political discussion?
You know, I think it's really important to recognize that some of these, challenges are universal. There are differences for sure. So mass incarceration deeply affected the, African-American community much more than the rural white community. But as you can see from, the Nat family, they were thrown in jail as well. I do think that it's really important for us to, take a practical lens and just, look at people as people. If there is an injustice or if there are over incarceration for certain groups of people, we need to fix that and not think, oh, well, this is just the law. Clearly, there was law misapplied. And also it was targeted to a group of people that really compounded the problems in the community. So when there's been so much research that shows when, African-American fathers or men are thrown into jail, that just disrupts the entire family. And so you have communities of families who are, have distortions in their family life. It makes it very difficult. No sources of income, or, two income families are much more stable than one income, let alone, a zero income family. So, we do think that there are ways to address some of these, mistaken policies, and some of them just have to be repealed.
Tightrope was published before the pandemic, and I'd love to hear what each of you thinks about the impact of the pandemic on the working class struggles you describe. In Milwaukee County, we're expecting more than 500 opioid-related deaths this year. That would be an increase of 100. Are you worried that the working class, which is in some respects struggling mightily today, will struggle even more because of the fallout from the pandemic?
Yes, Mike, and we're already seeing that. I mean, the two of the issues that we really emphasize are the cost of a loss of jobs, not only on one's income, but on one's identity, one's self-esteem, one's sense of purpose, and of course, healthcare. And so today we have 11 million fewer people employed in America than we did in February. And 3 million of those people have lost all health insurance as well. One of the things we write about is social isolation and the cost of loneliness, which there's now abundant evidence is, as lethal as smoking, for example. And the evidence is, as you suggest, that the consequence of this social isolation is more abuse of alcohol, more abuse of narcotics in ways that are increasing the number of overdoses, for example. The one silver lining, I think, is that I hope that COVID-19 has made America see more clearly the costs of 50 years of neglect, and the fact that we are the only advanced country in the world that doesn't have universal health care, that doesn't have universal paid sick leave. In a time of chronic disease, we may feel less interest in those who don't get health care for diabetes, who can't take paid sick leave for their high blood pressure, whatever it may be. But in times of infectious disease, all of a sudden everybody is kind of rattled if somebody else doesn't get healthcare, if somebody else can't get a test, if somebody else can't take time off from their restaurant job and still serve. So I'm hoping that Americans will see a little bit more plainly the cost of these failed policies and will result in a little bit more of a mandate to try to address some of these long-term needs.
Sheryl, are you optimistic that in some ways the pandemic can be a catalyst for us taking another look at policy solutions to some of what we've discussed today?
Well, I really hope so. So far, I don't see signs of that. I mean, there's bubblings of people talking about it, but we're in the middle of the crisis. So I think that people are not yet prepared to do so. But I really do hope that a new deal, just that was born out of depression-like, circumstances, where we're very close to. I do hope that something like that will actually emerge from this pandemic, because, I think that a lot of these, programs that we're talking about, they're there for a purpose. They're not there just because of big government. This has nothing to do with the labels. It really has to do with how do we fix something and what is the best way to fix it. And leaving it alone and not engaging, that's not a solution. That doesn't fix the problem. It's not going to go away unless we actually do something to fix it. And we can't become a more unified, fully reaching full potential country unless we do fix our problems.
I'd probably be remiss if I didn't ask at least one political question, and that is based on the fact that I think, Nick, you mentioned in the book that Yam Hill, the area where you're from, the county where you're from, went heavily for Donald Trump in 2016. It's 57-32, I think is off the top of my head. What are you hearing now when you go out to Yam Hill to visit family and you go back? Is it the same? Are they staying with the president at this point in time?
So I'd say that most of those who voted for President Trump in 2016 will vote for him again this time. And they do that partly because of conservative judges, partly because of gun rights. I think also there is some defensiveness and some perception that elites are looking down on them and thinking of them as deplorable or bigots or racist. And so that has created, I think, some antagonism. But so I think most people who voted for Trump last time will stick with him. But that's most. And I do think there is some drift away. I think that's largely economically driven, that there are a lot of folks who are really hurting and they're not fully sure that they should be blaming the president. They're not really sure who to blame, but they had voted for him because he talked about bringing jobs back, about making rural America strong again. And it is very clear that whatever has happened, rural America is not strong right now, that people are out of jobs, that they're desperate, that they're having trouble putting food on their plates. And so I do sense some drift away for that reason.
Sheryl, do you share that sentiment?
I do, but I also think that people find ways to justify their position. And when they listen to like Fox News, for instance, they get a narrative and they just absorb that narrative. So for instance, people are saying that, the reason my economy is not doing very well right now, is because the Democrats shut down the economy, and they're blaming it on the Democrats. And COVID, they say, well, that wasn't the president's fault. COVID is something that just happened from the Chinese. They're sort of buying into this narrative. And, what could we do? This is just, what it is. And then it was the Democrats who shut it down when actually I don't even see COVID around here. It hasn't hit this part of Oregon as deeply as it hit New York. And so people think, oh, is it fake? And the last thing is that a lot of people don't necessarily see the connection between the leadership, the top leader, the president, and what actually impacts them. Because some of them don't even know that Obamacare really is what is allowing them to go to the hospital and, on the equivalent of Medicaid. So there is this disconnect. And so, it's really has to do with how do you persuade people to change? And that's very hard.
Nick, I'll give you the final word. When you go back home, how do people treat you? You told their stories, do they respond to you the same way? They know maybe in some cases they don't share your politics. Are you welcome when you go back home to Yam Hill?
We were a little concerned about how Tightrope would be greeted in Yam Hill because we do cover, a lot of the ugly problems. We aired a lot of dirty laundry. But I think people here know how much I love this community, that I'm a part of it. I was with them on the bus. I ran against them in high school. We dated, we scribbled notes to each other. So I think that has helped. And also, I think above all, while people don't share my political values for the most part of my solutions, they very much want to feel that they are heard. So they don't, folks here, they don't want your sympathy. They do want your respect. And I think that they feel that they were heard and they were respected, and they're glad that they can help illuminate a sense of profound neglect that they feel here and that they feel for the working class across the country.
And we're actually even going to be spending more time in Yam Hill because now we're actually starting to grow grapes and apples. And, you know, hopefully we will try to help revive the local economy with Kristof wine and Kristof cider.
Well, good luck to you. And I hope you don't have any fires issues out there where you are. I'm hoping the best for you.
It was 5 miles away, but it stopped, but we're all nervous.
Good. Well, let's hope that it stays, it continues not to be a problem for you and your new venture. Nick Kristof, Sheryl WuDunn, thank you so much. The name of the book, again, is Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. It's a great read, and it is now out in paperback, too, so you can pick it up and order it from your local bookstore. Thanks so much for telling your story and what you've learned over this couple of years of reporting. It's good to be with you, and thanks to everybody who tuned in today for On the Issues. We'll see you next time.